All right, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the very best in college football coverage with the very best contributors. See, there's synergy there. One equals the other, such as Steve Dace, Michigan Podcast. We bring on Steve as much as we possibly can for some great discussions concerning Michigan football, the Big Ten, and the nation. Steve, how you doing tonight?
I'm well, Mark. How are you?
I am doing just fine. So over the past few weeks, I would love to hit you with this topic: scheduling in college football, both conference and non-conference scheduling. So I hate scheduling in college football. I hate that it's in the hands of the conferences because they screw it up. And more so, I hate that the non-conference is in the hands of the particular programs because they have their own agendas. So what I would like to do, Steve, with conference scheduling is, first of all, bring everyone to the same level of conference games, and that would be 9 for me in the 12-game overall schedule. So everyone plays the 9 games in conference. So we have an issue right now as I review, for example, Steve, the SEC schedule. Georgia this season, and let's, for anybody out there who's going to jump specifically to how good these teams are or are supposed to be, let's throw that out the door. And my objective, Steve, is to create as balanced a schedule as possible, as competitive a balanced a schedule as possible within the conference. So Georgia right now, in addition to their division schedule, and if anyone's unfamiliar, the SEC and the ACC play everyone in their division, so that's the 6 other teams. Then they only play 8 total conference games out of 13 possible opponents, so they only play 2 non-division games, and one of them is a constant rival that they play every year, and then the other one rotates. So this year, Georgia, in addition to playing the Eastern Division, plays Auburn and LSU. Those 2 teams last year, Steve, went 13-3 in the SEC. Tennessee plays Alabama and Auburn, the 2 best teams in the other division from last season, who went 14-2. Conversely, Vanderbilt plays Ole Miss and Arkansas, who went 4-12 last season. And again, I believe people are going to jump on the narrative that, well, Vanderbilt's not expected to do much. They're not very good. Let's give them a light schedule, where I'm trying to achieve schedule balance. So I've done that in reworking while maintaining the rivalries, reworking the schedule to get everyone close to an 8-8 composite record for the 2 teams that they play in the other division from the previous season. The thing we can't, of course, predict is how good teams are going to be the next year, which I have a lot of people challenging me with that, trying to predict how good the teams are. We can't do that. Secondly, the issue of the imbalance of the quality of the divisions comes into play, and that hurts the metric that I'm trying to create. It makes it more difficult for a scheduler like myself to schedule because the West wins more than the East. Plus, then you've got the rivalry games that I kept intact, meaning Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, Tennessee, and LSU, Florida. The other so-called rivalry games don't mean anything. I would toss those out. So there's my schedule formula for each and every conference.
Well, let me say this. You look at the NFL, which has a very complicated scheduling formula to try to come up with as much parity as possible. But year in and year out, when you base your strength of schedule off of what a team's record was last year, but you look at the average in the NFL over the last, I think it's 15 to 20 years, Mark, on average, they have 5 new playoff teams a year. All right, so right now, go look at last year's teams that made the playoffs in the NFL, in both the AFC and the NFC, and just randomly pick 5 of them and throw them out. Because on average, that's how many will not return the next year. And so that's the danger when you do scheduling rankings based off of what somebody's record was a year ago. What I would do, I agree with your central lament about the scheduling. I'm a Big Ten guy, but I don't blame the SEC at all for doing 8 games and then doing that one non-conference game the week before rivalry weekend. So everybody gets a bye, basically. They play, Short Hairs U and Armpit Tech that second to last weekend of the year. And the chances of injury go down, and you kind of most of their teams are at their best going into those rivalry weekends. I don't blame them for that, even though it's a bad deal if you're a Big Ten fan like me, because all they're doing is exploiting the rules as they are. And frankly, what I would do is fault the Big Ten for not emulating what the SEC is doing. Like, well, it's working for them. What I would do to get rid of all that is to me, you can't police how tough a conference is. What I would do instead is look at the non-conference scheduling. If I were the college football commissioner, what would happen is every team in their 12-game schedule would have to play at least 10 Power 5 games, at least. And if you wanted to play an FCS game, meaning if you're in a state like Iowa, where I live, for example, and you only have 2 FBS level programs, and you've got to schedule another game, and then the taxpayers of Iowa are like, why are we paying Tulsa, $500,000 to come in here and play the University of Iowa when you give that money to the University of Northern Iowa and fund scholarships that are largely going to go to kids that played high school football in Iowa. So I'd leave the accommodation if you wanted to play an FCS game, fine, knowing that would hurt your strength of schedule standing in terms of the college football playoff in the New Year's Six. And then if you wanted to play a group of 5 team, you were welcome to do that. If you didn't want to play a group of 5 team, you wanted to play 11 or 12 Power 5 games, that's fine. But and Notre Dame would count in that Power 5 too, obviously. So that would be 65 total teams within that grouping if you count Notre Dame. So if everybody had to play at least 10 Power 5 games, everybody plays 9 conference games, and I think that would go a long way to addressing the scheduling imbalance issue. When I look at Alabama's schedule this year, and it's not their fault. They're in what is perennially the toughest conference in America. They scheduled Louisville for that big showcase game, and Louisville has been a decent football program for even before Lamar Jackson, going back to when Bobby Petrino coached there the first time, Mark. But when you look at, they're a 31-point favorite right now, the early Vegas line on that season opening showcase game. When I go down Alabama's schedule, I think Alabama, the entire time Nick Saban has coached there, they have played, are you ready for this? 2 non-conference road games, Mark, 2. The entire time Saban's been there, one was against Penn State, and then one was against Duke. Those are their only 2 road games. When we played Florida in one of those kickoff classics last September, the opening weekend, that was the first time that the University of Florida had left the state for a non-conference game since like 1999. I think it was against against Syracuse or something like that. Okay, so that's what's ridiculous. I think if you fix the non-conference portion, because here's the other thing too with conference schedules, familiarity breeds contempt, and you're not as intimidated. Ole Miss is not as good as Alabama, but you're not as intimidated playing Alabama as, say, Louisville might be, because you see them every single year. Northwestern's not as intimidated playing Ohio State like, say, Oklahoma State might be. The horseshoe would be a kind of a new thing to them. Northwestern's like, we're here every other year. When they don't beat us, it's only because they're better than us, not because they threw their helmets out there, the crowd was loud. Right? So I kind of let the conferences handle their own business. I would address the non-conference portion of the scheduling. Everybody has to play 10 Power 5 games. You are permitted an FCS game, knowing going in that hurts your schedule marker and metric with the college football playoff and the New Year's Six. And then if you want to play a group of 5 team in the non-conference, that's fine. And everybody plays nine conference games, because you'll rarely run into a situation that Alabama has this year where I can't find a game until the finale at home against Auburn in the Iron Bowl, which is at home, a revenge game. I can't find a game on their schedule right now that I don't think they aren't at least a 17-point favorite in, as we are looking at it sitting here tonight on May the 10th.
We're on the line with Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. You can join him on all the major audio platforms, as well as here on YouTube. Just search Michigan Podcast for the very best in Michigan football coverage, not just from Steve, but he brings on some top-notch contributors to his platform. I am monitoring the chat. When I see something that's worth commenting on, I will go to it. I'm glad, Steve, that you brought up Iowa. If I was a Hawkeyes fan, those fans, that fan base in regards to anticipating a schedule each year must be bored to tears, because while the rest of us anticipate, if you're an Ohio State fan and you look at the future schedules and you see TCU and Oregon and the like, and in the past few years, of course, Oklahoma, Virginia Tech, and I could go down all the major powers in college football and even the non-major powers, Iowa has scheduled the FCS in the group of 5, and they scheduled the one Power 5 that they're obligated to by the Big Ten. And even before that standard came into play, And it's always Iowa State. So you know who Iowa is playing every year. They're going to play their North Dakota State or whatever it turns out to be, Northern Illinois, but nobody cares about those games. They want to see who the Power 5 game is against. And for Iowa, it's always Iowa State.
Well, this is something I know a lot about because I'm a native here, and I used to do sports talk radio in Iowa. And, the two teams didn't play for like 40 years. And the state legislature back in the 1970s got involved and said, no, you two need to play, and essentially forced them legislatively, forced the University of Iowa to play Iowa State again. Iowa State really needed this game, even when Hayden Fry was beating them 15 years in a row, because their program was the dreck of dreck. With one, they had a bright spot there in the early 70s when John Cooper was here. Earl Bruce, the recently deceased Earl Bruce, great guy, loved Earl, got to know him when he coached our Arena League team early in my career. And boy, he told me some great stories about Woody Hayes. Maybe before we get out of here, you remind me, Mark. I'm gonna share with you my favorite Woody Hayes story that Earl Bruce once told me. All right, but when Earl was at Iowa State, they were nationally a top 20 team. I mean, he was winning at Nebraska in the mid-70s. Other than that, though, you're talking about an doesn't have a conference title since the Titanic sunk, 1912. And so Iowa State needed Iowa to play them to raise the overall stature of their program. But now when you looked at Iowa State, under Dan McCarney, who was a good friend of mine, and his successor, Paul Rhodes, they got to be kind of a perennial bowl team. Matt Campbell's kind of gotten them back to that spot. I saw USA Today actually had Iowa State in its preseason top 25. All right, so if Iowa State doesn't need the Iowa game the way that it used to, and if I were an Iowa fan, I'd probably go to Iowa State and say, hey, how about we take every decade, we take 2 years off? Because there's been some years that Iowa has played like a Pittsburgh and an Iowa State. You should never do that now. I mean, you should never double up on Power 5 non-conference teams. Like what USC is doing with Notre Dame and Texas is playoff suicide. On top of playing 9 conference games, you're almost eliminating yourself before the season starts. Okay, so when Iowa's not doing the Pittsburgh and Iowa State thing anymore since we went to the playoff, what Iowa should do is go to Iowa State and say, you know what, every decade we take 2 years off so that we can play a home and home, moving our team around the country, and you do the exact same thing because we don't want to lose this rivalry. It's a great thing in our home state. Several years ago for our cable company, I did a local college game day on site from Jack Trice Stadium when Iowa came in number 8 in the country with Drew Tate. And 70,000 Iowans were at that game, and Jack Trice only seats 50,000 people. And we had such a huge crowd behind us as I was broadcasting live there outside the stadium. It was like our own college game day. It's a huge event in our state. But yeah, if I were an Iowa fan, I'd be like, I don't want to lose that. It's uniquely Iowan. But every once in a while, I'd kind of like us to play somebody else. And you know what? You guys are a program now. You're back to being decent again. So every decade, we take a 2-year break and play a home and home against somebody else around the country. And that way, we got 2 years to build that good old-fashioned hate back up again when we get back together and kind of renew this thing, and that keeps a little variety there. So I'm with you on that.
Steve Deace joins me from Michigan Podcast. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel where I bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry. Before I get to the non-conference scheduling, Steve, and my formula, one more jab at the conference scheduling. Example here is going to be the Big Ten. Again, folks out there, do not rate the level of the program because I know you want to take it easy on the lesser teams and make it more difficult on the harder teams. Within the conference, I don't get that. So, for example, in the Big Ten East, as you well know, Michigan playing Nebraska, Northwestern, and Wisconsin, a combined 19-8 last season in conference. Maryland, let's say Maryland was as good as Michigan because I know that this is going to help the narrative with some folks out there that want to see competitive scheduling just if you're good enough. Let's say Maryland was good. They are playing a composite 3 games from the West, Steve. 6-21 out of those 3 teams. 19-8 for Michigan, 6-21 for Maryland, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. That's not fair. Nebraska's got the big 3 or 3 of the big 4 in the Eastern Division. Nebraska has to play a 20-7 slate of Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and you could argue that Michigan's even better than the 5-4 that they put up. So that's more egregious than even that 20-7 mark versus Iowa, who's a chief competitor with Nebraska, they play Penn State, Indiana, Maryland, a combined 11-16 last year. Just think that that can be worked out, and I did it here. Looking at the non-conference real quick, Steve. So I'm going to hit the best of both worlds with the Iowa situation. We schedule the 9 conference games. We got 3 left to build the 12-game schedule. I allow every school to go out and schedule 1 game. Group of 5, FCS, whoever you want to play. My scheduling committee is going to schedule 2 games, and the goal of those 2 games is to be a composite 500 conference record from the season before. So everyone, unlike the NFL, it sometimes gets compared to an NFL schedule, which is trying to create parity. I am trying to create just as balanced a schedule as possible, as fair a schedule based on last season's results.
I don't know that you can do that, Mark, because teams are so different every year. I mean, Georgia went from 8-5 to the college football playoff. You know, so what I would do is I would put teams in tiers. And you know, for example, what I'd be doing, Rick Neuheisel has been suggesting this on Sirius XM, and I agree. Louisville's a 31-point underdog. There ought to be a commissioner that can come right in right now and say, tell you what, since that game's going to be played in Orlando anyway, and Central Florida's out there printing up national championship shirts and banners, they're not going to, even Central Florida is not going to be a 31-point underdog to Alabama. The Vegas would take 10 points off that spread with what Central Florida has coming back. And now you've got a compelling storyline. And so Alabama's going to play Central Florida week 1 instead. I just think there's so many variables when you get into how different teams are from one year to the next. Last year, Brian Kelly was fired. Notre Dame went 4-8. You know, then he went 10-3. Last year, Mark D'Antonio was fired. He went 3-9. Then he went 10-3. I mean, teams are so. That's why I'm kind of chuckling as a Michigan fan. And you know, you've heard me. I've been plenty critical of, you know, some of what went on last season with Coach Harbaugh. But listening to all of this college football media, I almost posted this Twitter question, and then I decided not to. I was going to post on my Twitter feed, after listening to national college football media, what should the University of Michigan do? A, cancel their football program today. B, cancel the football program tomorrow. C, cancel the football program the day after that. Because the idea that these guys will never get better, Shea Patterson won't make a difference, it'll be like John O'Korn all over again. So much of this analysis is totally based off what the teams did just last season. So, you know, you look at Penn State, they lost their top 5 tacklers. They lost a once-in-a-generation offensive player. They lost their best wide receiver. They lost an All-American tight end. And then they lost the offensive coordinator. Does anybody remember what Penn State's offense was before Joe Moorhead? Do you remember that? It was Chuck and Duck with a quarterback who hated James Franklin so much that when he went pro early, he literally thanked every Homo sapien on planet Earth except for his only head coach. He went out of his way not to thank his only head coach or his head coach. Okay, so Joe Moorhead, you can make an argument, is as much a reason for why James Franklin turned the Penn State program around as anybody else. Go to the whiteout in 2016 when they beat Ohio State, and go look at what was being said after we put it on him 49-7, and he's calling us to go for it to kick a field goal on 4th and inches to avoid a shutout. You remember that? He was fired. People were firing James Franklin. Now he's a top 10 coach, and they won't miss Joe Moorhead at all, Mark. No, not at all. What? It's like Joe Moorhead. What's a Joe Moorhead? They'll just pick right up where they left off. And a Saquon Barkley, they just get those guys every year at Penn State. Here's what happens. If you win your bowl game last year and you return the starting quarterback, then all the college football media tells us the very next year how absolutely great you are. You know, and that's what's going on. So I don't know how much you can do this off of last year. I love Greg McElroy. I'm going to pick on him for a minute because I love him. He's a great analyst, one of the best on TV. But let me give you an example of why he's an example of what I'm talking about. I watched college football live on ESPN the day Shea Patterson made his transfer to Michigan official last December. And Greg is on ESPN's College Football Live saying this is going to make Michigan a playoff contender next year. I turn on a Sirius XM show, which I listen to almost every morning for at least 15 minutes. First Team is what it's called. Him and Taylor Zarzour, another ESPN play-by-play guy. And now, just yesterday, the previous day, he's on College Football Live. This guy's going to put Michigan in the playoff picture next year. I turn it on the next morning, and I don't really see the fit between Shea Patterson and Jim Harbaugh's offense. It's like, yo, life comes at you fast, bro. I mean, I'm listening to all these analysts right now. Hey, do you remember when Jim had Andrew Luck, doing the veer? He was running down the line and pitching the ball to Stanford's tailbacks. Do you remember that? How about when Colin Kaepernick's career just exploded, Mark, after Jim left the NFL and stopped bottling him up? Did you remember how that happened? How that went down? I am watching this analysis, and it's beyond ridiculous. Like, Jim didn't introduce the RPO and the zone read to the NFL with a quarterback no one thought could play, and Colin Kaepernick went into the Super Bowl within 6 inches of a rain delay of winning the damn thing. And then after he went to the NFL, Kaepernick's career's in the tank. He's known more for what he writes on his shoes than what he does on between the lines. And it's all of a sudden like, because we got stuck with John O'Korn last year, Jim doesn't know how to coach quarterbacks anymore. I bring this example up to show we can't be prisoner to what happened last year in college football. It's a new season every year. 120 guys are going pro early. 1/3 of them every year now. 1/3 of them are not getting drafted. When you have this much roster turnover every year, I think it's really difficult to base how we're going to balance things off of what happened last season. When we do too much of that already with preseason rankings and everything else, listen, I think Georgia's schedule is a joke. I'd probably favor them in 11 of their 12 games. But their defense was decimated by the NFL. They have a quarterback controversy on their hands. They lost the best tailback tandem in the history of the Southeastern Conference, Mark, statistically. They were the best tailback tandem in the history of the SEC. And this idea that they're already in everybody's top 4, based on what? Well, based on what they did last year. Well, most of those guys that did it last year aren't coming back. And so I think it's really difficult to constantly base what we're going to do the next year off of what we did last year.
So I would add one other metric that I believe these analysts use, and I think you even used it in your formula. In addition to the returning quarterback, the record from the previous season, it would be the recruiting ranking would come into play. And as long as a Penn State and especially a Georgia gives us the recruiting ranking we're looking for, even though a majority of that class isn't going to have a major impact this first season, people still love that, and that seems to carry more weight than it should, at least initially.
How about we did this? Mark? How about if we just rotated non-conference pairings with conferences? Like do you see the Big Ten ACC Challenge in basketball?
Yes.
So how about we just rotate? Big Ten ACC 1 year, next year Big Ten SEC, next year Big Ten Big 12, next year Big Ten Pac-12, right? And well, you have some conferences that don't have enough teams. Well, you know what? You take a school like Central Florida, which has an undergraduate population of 70,000 students, and they're in a major market. They're in a recruiting area the Big 12 needs. If you've been watching the NFL draft the last couple of years, Big 12 needs to get some more talent. Put schools like Central Florida, BYU, which has been a national program most of our lives. Put programs like Central Florida and BYU into the Big 12 and make sure everybody's got 14 teams, and make Notre Dame go to the ACC full-time or join the Big Ten. And let's just rotate this around and do it that way. And everybody gets to see everybody play at least once every few years.
Steve, about this time last year, I did you one better, I believe, by building 6 12-team conferences. I rebuilt the Big East. I took Penn State out of the Big Ten. I got Boston College together, Syracuse, Maryland, Rutgers, brought up West Virginia, Louisville. I tried to bulk it up with some stretches there geographically, but it was still a Big East conference. And then I made 6 12-team conferences. I took Texas A&M, Mizzou, threw them back into the Big 12. I took Central Florida and South Florida. They filled the gaps in the ACC after I plucked away 4 teams to go elsewhere. Anyway, I built the 12-team 6 conferences. And then we went ahead with pretty much what your format is there. I went with the the ACC versus the Big Ten this year, and then the next year, and I rotated.
Here's the other reason I'd be careful about messing around with conference schedules. You got a lot of Alabama alums and fans that live in a place like Nashville, for example, that the cost of going to a game in Tuscaloosa, the ticket demand, etc. And but the only chance they get to see Alabama is every other year playing, Vanderbilt, or every 4 or 5 years when Vanderbilt comes up in the
every 6 years, Steve.
Rotation.
Every 6 years.
It's every 6 years. There you go. Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that they're going to play them any less in my formula. This just guarantees that Alabama is going to play Tennessee. And let's say Tennessee went 5-3 in the conference last year. We're going to try to find a 3-5 team to match them up with to give Alabama a composite 8-8, 2 teams to play.
I'll tell you what, you make everybody play 9 conference games.
Yeah.
Make everybody play 10 Power 5 games. And then I am more than willing to negotiate with you on how we get there, including messing around with the conference schedules.
All right, we got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast. Please join him on YouTube as well as all the major audio platforms. And I ask that you subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I've got Cam Underwood from State of the U to Talk Miami coming up at 8:30 Eastern Time. Steve, we could talk forever. I jotted down some other subjects here that I'll have to toss your way in future weeks, but I appreciate you coming on.
So you want me to share my Earl Bruce story before I go?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Okay. So Earl and I are having lunch at an Italian restaurant here in Des Moines. He had just come in to coach our arena team, and the owner knew I was a big Big Ten football fan, Michigan fan. He wanted me to talk more positively about the arena team on my sports show. So he had me go out to lunch with Earl Bruce. We got a few cocktails in him, and the one that's somewhat not safe for work. All the other ones were not safe for work. Okay, the one that is somewhat not safe for work, I'm going to clean up for you a little bit. All right, so Earl is on his first recruiting trip with Coach Hayes. First time as a young assistant coach that he's going to get to go with Woody to visit a recruit. And it's the dead of January. And his job's to set up all the logistics and everything else. Got the car running outside. Woody pops in the passenger seat, rolls the window halfway down in the dead of January. Remember, he's famous for wearing those short sleeves, even when it was freezing cold. He wanted the air coming into the car. He didn't talk to Earl the entire drive. I think they went to Cincinnati or something. Didn't talk to him the whole drive there. He's reading one of his patent up World War II books. Earl's freezing his manly parts off in this car, right? And it's silent. Like won't talk to him, won't address him. It's like he's not even in the car. All of a sudden, they get to the recruit's house in Cincinnati. They pull in the drive. They walk in. What do you think Woody does when they walk in the house? Totally turns on the charm, man. He's on it. He is Mr. Charm offensive. It's like he's a whole new person. And he's eating them at a house and home. He couldn't be cooler, couldn't be nicer. Earl's like, this is a totally different guy. What's going on? So they get done. They get the recruit's commitment. They go outside, and Woody looks at me and says, all right, Earl, what do we got lined up for tonight? Where are we staying? And Earl says, well, I talked to this big Ohio State booster. He owns the nicest hotel in town. He's got us hooked up, separate rooms. We got color TV. It's going to be great, okay? And Woody's like, F that, we're not doing that. And Earl's like, what do you mean, Coach, we're not doing that? He goes, I don't want to go stay at that guy's hotel. You call the airport and you tell him Woody wants his room. Earl's like, you have a room at the airport? Call the effing airport and tell him Woody wants his room. All right, so he calls the airport thinking he's getting pranked, right? He calls the main switchboard and says, hi, I'm Coach Bruce, new assistant at Ohio State, and Coach Hayes wanted to inquire about his room. Like, oh, yeah, we've got it ready for him. Just whenever you pull in, he knows where to park, and he's got a spot reserved for him. Come on in. We'll have a room ready to go. Earl's like, this is really strange. So they get to the airport. They go around to this private space they've got reserved for Woody. They go in, and sure enough, Woody's room is actually where pilots who are doing the red-eye would crash, okay, overnight. So it's a hangar. It's like a male locker room with cots and one television and one bath. That's his room, all right? So they go in there, and Woody gets to go to the bathroom and shower first. Earl's got to go really bad. He's holding it the whole time. Finally, Woody gets out. Earl goes in, goes to the restroom, showers up, comes out. All the lights are on, and Woody is reading that same World War II book. And Earl's like, I got to watch some TV or something. He goes to turn the TV on, and Woody goes, no. Okay, all right. And Earl goes to lay back down, and he can't sleep. And he's waiting for the old man to fall asleep. And slowly but surely, he starts sinking into the sheets, right? And he's out. And Earl waits for a few minutes to see if he's asleep. And then when he thinks he's asleep, he starts to get up to turn the TV on. Woody sits straight up in bed and screams out, F them all. F every last one of them. And Earl's like, Coach is crazy. All right. So he can't sleep the whole night, wondering what the coach is going to do, or what he's going to do next. Next morning, they go downstairs to the cafe in the airport. And it's the morning rush crowd, and Woody's taking pictures, and he's signing autographs. Couldn't be a nicer guy. It's like a totally different guy again. And suddenly he's asking Earl about his family and stuff, and he treated like a human being for once. And after the crowd leaves, and it's just him and Coach, and he goes, Coach, I got to ask you a question. And Woody says, sure, or whatever. And he goes, Coach, last night, man, when you jumped up in bed in the middle of the night and started screaming, F them all, what was that all about? And he said, Woody slammed his fist on the table right there in the diner in the airport. He says, I meant F every one of those Ohio State alums and boosters who thinks I owe them anything, who thinks if I take a gift, if I take an honorarium, if I sleep in one of their hotel rooms, they can call me in the middle of the season and tell me how to run my damn football team. I don't want to owe anybody anything. And if any of them think I owe them anything, F them all. And years later, when Woody died, his wife went through like his private chest in his den, and she found honorarium checks going back to the late 50s and early 60s from booster clubs and Buckeye clubs that he never cashed, Mark, so that he would never owe anybody anything.
Okay. The last portion of that story right at the end clinched it all, certainly to build the integrity. That's tremendous. That is a great story, one of many, and you got to hear it firsthand. Steve Deace.
I remember that like it was yesterday, man. I loved Earl Bruce. He was, and you know who else loved Earl Bruce, Mark? Bo Schembechler did. He loved Earl.
Yes, he was very good to Earl Bruce and said some very kind things during his firing at Ohio State, certainly in 1987. All right, Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. It's always fun.
Thanks, man.
We could hang out forever.
You bet. Go Blue.
Have a good night.